Welcome back, viewers at home. Joining us virtually is Brendon Petersen, a tech-savvy journalist and a consultant who's passionate about exploring the intersection of technology and society. Now, the question we are here to address this evening is what it means for internet connectivity in Africa, looking at the partnership between Vodacom and Starlink. Brendon, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get into looking at the partnership, kindly start us off because we are all aware of Vodacom and Vodafone and everything
Mhm.
around that. Can you please take us through understanding Starlink? What is Starlink about and what does it mean in terms of looking at what Starlink is?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Vodacom, Vodafone, MTN, Cell, all the networks we are so very familiar with. What makes them different to something like Starlink is that Starlink uses essentially a constellation of low Earth orbit satellites, whereas, the networks that you mentioned, and that I mentioned as well, they use towers, land-based towers, to be able to send off a signal. So yeah, that's really what the difference is. It's not a ground-based infrastructure that's using those cables and things. It's actually using these satellites, which are a lot closer to Earth than a lot of these sort of geostationary ones. So things like the latency and those things can be a little bit lower. And what's nice about these is because they're not ground-based, the service can actually reach places where you're not able to lay cable or you're not able to build any towers. So the key difference really, instead of having the signal travel to a fixed ground station, the satellite system brings broadband and beams it down from space.
And looking at the fact that, I'm looking at Vodacom, MTN, this is like a oligopoly structure. And now seeing that Vodacom is now partnering with Starlink, I can't help wonder, but what would be the impact on Africa's digital landscape and not forgetting, the current, structure of, specifically in South Africa in terms of now, Vodacom now partnering with Starlink.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these networks are legacy infrastructures, as you said, and what this is meant to do, and the emphasis is on, the potential,
Mm,
is that this is supposed to open, doors and open access to people where, as I said, with terrestrial service, they're not able to build out the infrastructure, the cables, all the sort of things to certain areas where they just unfortunately isn't physically possible. So, by integrating Starlink's sort of satellite infrastructure into Vodacom's existing network, it essentially means that Vodacom, which is obviously the largest network in the country, is going to be able to extend more connectivity more aggressively into underserved areas, so the difficult terrain, more rural, more remote areas. So the idea behind this is that this is supposed to help reduce the digital divide in Africa, where access to high-speed internet
mm,
is very patchy. So this potentially could then mean more competition and alternative paths for connectivity. So not just fiber in city centers or certain hotspots. It could also be a boost for rural communities and businesses, and it's going to put hopefully pressure on a lot of the incumbent providers, the fiber providers, a lot of the other networks, to improve their service. Because as much as we talk about Starlink, Starlink is not the only name in the game. It's just the most well-known name in the game. So
mm.
hopefully this then opens doors to others to be able to bring these services in and lower that cost, and then also potentially maybe even lower the cost of normal services.
Hmm. And I think with that, when we look at the idea of being connected or just, the internet itself, there comes a concern around data privacy. And looking at this partnership, is there any concerns that you would like to share with viewers at home to be on the lookout of, or there are no concerns around data privacy?
Listen, I think there's always a concern around data privacy. I think one of the things I've said time and time again is privacy, security needs to be built in from the ground up and not bolted on afterwards. And I think, with things like this, with these, satellite systems, obviously they cover vast, footprints, far bigger than terrestrial services. So data is obviously routed through infrastructure that may cross different borders, or may depend on a third-party gateway. So obviously this is going to raise questions about jurisdiction, control, legal protections, and then, if there's, for example, a non-local entity. So in the case of this Vodacom Starlink announcement, This is not actually meant for South Africa at the moment. This is talking about a lot of the neighboring countries. So therefore, you're looking at, for example, let's say Botswana. Vodacom would be, I suppose, technically could be considered a non-local entity providing their service, because also Starlink is US based. Vodacom, depending which division they use, may not be Botswana based. So then it's all of those things of what regulations they adhere to and what their data privacy laws are. Then, of course, it's local regulation in that country, oversight enforcement. So it does become very, very complex, and it is a question that I think we should be asking more and more, because what types of data is going to be transmitted, over these satellite networks? How much data is going to be shared? And I was just having a conversation with Cisco's country digitization manager earlier, and he said, that's a one non-negotiable for them. With no matter what they do with any partner conversation, is security is always at the heart of everything. And I don't think enough questions have been asked of Starlink and Vodacom about this in terms of their data privacy and security.
And just moving away from that, will Starlink be more affordable than the current internet options that are existing out there?
That's not an easy question to answer, to be very honest. I think in some cases, no, but I think in some cases, I'm hoping that they might do some sort of special deals or things, because I know that there are certain countries that are served by Starlink right now in Africa, where people are saying that the cost of Starlink versus the cost of what they would normally pay for data of the same speed, Starlink is cheaper. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the case everywhere. So it's a bit of a yes, it's a bit of a no, whether it is going to be cheaper. But it does depend on the internet options in the area, what the pricing is, all of those sort of things. So if you look at existing fiber, in urban areas, Starlink is probably going to be more expensive than that, because there's already a lot of infrastructure there. If you look in remote and rural areas where, connectivity is usually very expensive, very unreliable, this you're starting to the potential to offer better value, because the alternative might just be very slow, or just doesn't exist at all. So it depends on a few things, equipment costs, subscription fee, installation, regulatory costs, and whether the provider is actually going to be bundling that service with any other offerings. So I'm hoping that it will be, but we don't have any firm answers at this stage, unfortunately.
And looking at limitations, are there any limitations to using Starlink? Like, as we currently know that once it starts raining or there's like, heavy winds, you are expecting to be disconnected in that sense. So with
Yep.
Starlinks, are there any limitation that we should be aware of?
You've named exactly one of the biggest ones, which is weather. So heavy rain, some storms. And then because it's satellite, you also need line of sight, so you could get obstructions there, which could be trees, hills, buildings, So you still need to have a dish that has a very fairly clear view of the sky. And then, coverage also may initially be limited. It's not, as I said, there's a lot of infrastructure that still needs to be rolled out, so it's not going to be an overnight solution. So, you know, don't expect it to be the solution to your problems immediately. Um, and then because Sapphire covers such wide areas that when network capacity is finite, so if there's too many people on one sort of satellite beam, then it's essentially like, remember the days when you get home in the evening, you want to stream something, but now all of a sudden your speed is slower because everybody's home and streaming? The same kind of thing. So it's not going to be perfect, and obviously installation and equipment costs can sometimes be higher. So, there are going to be some limitations, but unfortunately, that is the case with any sort of new technology.
And I believe that if this partnership becomes something that is, yielding, profits or results at that, this will inspire other telecommunications to look into, partnering with, similar satellite, companies like that of Starlink. And this brings me to ask you, what are the benefits of, or rather, how might this partnership influence other telecom companies in Africa?
I'm hoping that this is going to drive connectivity, because, not only did I speak to Cisco today, and, we're talking about Starlink at the moment. The Starlink announcement comes during what we call Africa Tech, or AfricaCom.
Okay.
And that's, an annual event that happens every year. And the big thing with AfricaCom this year has been, Africa First and connectivity. And that's what Starlink is going to bring, hopefully for the rural communities especially, is connectivity. Because if you want to talk about, last week we spoke about DPI, digital public infrastructure, connecting people, digital IDs, digital driver's licenses, access to healthcare services. how do we bring those services to everybody in every part of the country if everybody doesn't have connectivity? So Starlink plays a role in, helping us solve that. There's economic opportunities for small businesses, farmers, there's social inclusion, there's infrastructure that we can sort of just jump over instead of having to build all of that physical infrastructure for, towers and things. And then, as I said, healthcare, just being able to get online and be able to speak to a doctor. So there's a lot of potential that Starlink has and a lot of benefits that it could bring. It just depends on implementation.
Hmm. And just considering that early in the year, the Starlink was, a bit in a tense situation with the South African government around the triple BEE certification and so much. And this brings me to ask, what are the challenges in implementing Starlink services in South Africa? And is there going to be a way forward or a point of compromise, if I can say so?
Yeah, this one, this is when nuance and understanding a lot of those finer details becomes so crucial because it's not a clear cut, yes or no kind of situation. Some of the main challenges are obviously going to be regulatory and licensing issues. So that obviously speaks to the triple BEE initiatives that you just sort of referenced, from a few months ago. There's been a lot of conversation about how that might be sort of adjusted or restructured. Some people saying because of Starlink, government, saying that's not the reason why. It just hasn't fully been effective the way it's been implemented before. Obviously there's infrastructure logistics, and if you look at South Africa, there is a lot of development. We spoke about the clear line of sight that you're going to need. So there are those concerns. There's obviously cost and scale. For the service to be affordable, the cost must come down of equipment and installation, and it must have, a scale where enough people are able to access it, and they therefore obviously bring down the price. And then obviously there's market dynamics because you've got some areas where there's amazing fiber penetration, so how do you persuade those people to move to, Starlink?
Mm.
So that's also going to affect that sort of cost and scale. And then, like I said, earlier, geographical and obviously societal, obstacles. You need to have clear line of sight, and so many other things. So, it you need to have power supply. So if you look at, remote rural areas, how do you guarantee power supply? So, that's just one of the situations from that perspective that we have to deal with. So, there's a lot of nuance that needs to be looked at before that possibility of it being rolled out in South Africa becomes a reality.
Mm. And in wrapping up, Brendon, I want to find out, on a global landscape, when we're looking at satellite internet, what would you say is the future outlook for that? And also, what role do you think this technology will play in Africa's economic growth?
I want to be clear because we're speaking about this from a very positive perspective, and it does have a lot of potential. I
Yeah.
don't want people to think that this is a silver bullet. This is going to solve all our problems. I think connectivity is vital. I think being able to bring that to people who never had that is an incredible thing. But I hope that this is not the only option and way forward. In terms of that sort of impact, you know, looking at the way forward, we spoke last week about digital being the future of everything. That means connectivity is a foundational, sort of enabler of an economy, of a modern economy, whether it's education, whether it's commerce, whether, remote work, supply chains, health, e-governance, these e-government services that looking being rolled out. It becomes such a vital part of that. And there's this wonderful stat from a report that I was just reading from Cisco where we've got such a vast percentage of young people in this country and on this continent who are interested in AI and becoming entrepreneurs. And you don't see, we're talking about like 80% of people surveyed are interested in AI. 80% of that 80% want to be entrepreneurs. That all hinges on, digital literacy, education, and connectivity, which a lot of people don't have access to because of no connectivity. So that I think really gives us the opportunity to leapfrog what we see happening in the world and on the continent really push at the forefront. So there's a lot of potential from so many perspectives. But again, as I say, I don't think that this is the silver bullet. I think this is part of a bigger solution to a far bigger problem.
Brendon, thank you so much for that insight and just giving us the understanding around, this partnership. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Viewers at home, that was our tech savvy journalist as well as consultant Brendon Petersen sharing in on, his view on terms of the partnership between Vodacom and that of Starlink and what it means in terms of connectivity for Africa.